Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Climate Services webinar. I'm Maggie Hurwitz from the Weather Service Climate Services branch, and today we have an exciting presentation by Krista Peters-Lagarde, continuing in our series of webinars related to drought. So before I introduce Krista, after she gives her presentation, there'll be lots of time for questions. So you can use the raise your hand feature in GoToWebinar, or you can type a question into the question box. I'm going to be the moderator today, so if you have any technical issues, you can also just put a question in the chat box, and I'll try to get to that. So as I said, today's speaker is Dr. Krista Peters-Lagarde, who is the acting chief scientist and also the deputy director for hydrosphere, biosphere, and geophysics at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She's had many career accolades, including being a fellow of HEU and AMS, and played a role in my career path. And she's really the one who gets the credit for introducing me to drought and the challenges of defining and monitoring and predicting drought. And today she's going to focus on a recent paper related to the state of drought indicators for monitoring and prediction. So over to you, Krista.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. Okay, so let me get rid of the webcam. Okay, so as Maggie said, this talk is a bit of an overview of a paper that we recently submitted to BAMS, and I want to acknowledge the folks listed there as the co-authors, David Mako, Lou Su, Dennis Lettenmeyer, Pierre Gentine, and Mike Barlage. And, as part of that, I'll get back to that in a minute, but those names listed there are there because we were all the co-leads for the third NOAA Drought Task Force, which I will explain. So the outline of the talk today is just a little bit of an overview of the NOAA MAP Drought Task Force. I'm going to talk a little bit about indicators, give you some background, and then I'm really going to zoom in on this idea of model-based drought reconstruction and using a new model-based drought reconstruction that we did as part of the task force. We're going to talk about the physical impacts on drought, specifically adding things like dynamic vegetation phenology, groundwater, and then a little bit about snow at the end. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And, in case you're not aware, the NOAA Modeling, Analysis, and Prediction Program has sponsored, we're getting ready to start the fourth Drought Task Force, but we were part of the third Drought Task Force, which was really composed of PIs that were funded from FY17 to 20. And the goal of the task force is to really advance drought monitoring and prediction over North America, and of course with our partners at NIDIS. So as I mentioned, I was the lead for this, but the co-leads included Pierre, Dennis, Mike, and David. And basically the way this worked is we had monthly telecons, we invited speakers to most of those telecons, and we recently submitted all of our work to a special collection in the American Meteorological Society. As many of you may know, the American Meteorological Society special collections can span multiple journals. So we actually have a list here of the journal articles that were submitted. Some of them have already been accepted and some of them are still in review. But if you go through here, you can see it really is a mix of not only drought monitoring work, but drought prediction work as well. And so we expect that once enough of these are accepted, that there will be a web page on the AMS website announcing this special collection. And so I'll be sure to send the information to Maggie so that she can share that with this community once it gets posted. Okay, so let me move on to the rest of the outline, which is really focused on, thinking about indicators and thinking about physics and what the indicators mean with respect to the physics. Okay, so as you all know, many drought indicators are in use today. The classic Palmer index, as well as the standardized precipitation index, are probably the most historically prevalent indicators. More recently, with the advent of land surface models, we have been using things like soil moisture percentiles, which is shown in the middle here. This is the CPC product. We've also used our models and combined the models with observations from satellites like GRACE. GRACE is the Gravity, Recovery, and Climate Experiment, and you can start to use models to tell you things about the groundwater state. So this is an example of the groundwater indicator that comes from NASA Goddard. Down in the lower part are some of the more recent indicators that have a mix of remote sensing and other sources. So this one is the VEG-DRI, the Vegetation Drought Response Index. And you know, this one combines information from multiple sources, including remotely sensed vegetation indices. The Evaporative Stress Index, this is one that actually uses thermal data to estimate evaporative stress using an energy balance approach. This, related to energy balance, is this more recent index, which some of you may be familiar with, called EDDI, the Evaporative Demand Drought Index. And again, this really looks at the atmospheric demand, and this one, along with the Evaporative Stress Index, have been shown to be good indicators for flash droughts because they pick up on vegetation stress before soil moisture does, and often before the palmer does. So I think, you know, before you see the change in the precipitation, you might sense droughts like flash droughts that are temperature driven using indices like EDDI and ESI. And then the last one in the lower corner here is for snow. And this is looking at, you know, basically snowpack percentiles in certain parts of the West. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. And if you're a water manager or a user, it's hard to know which one of these you should look at. Or you could say, well, I should just look at, you know, I could just look at the drought monitor, which combines a lot of these pieces together. And I'll get to that in a minute. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize, and we talked about this in this paper, is that now that not only do we have models, but we have remote sensing, which can support not only national scale, but global drought monitoring, which I think is a new capability that we're really pushing for. And NASA has a role to play there because some of these missions, like for precipitation, we have this global precipitation measurement mission. We have products from GPM that give precipitation on a 10-kilometer grid globally every 30 minutes. So it's really amazing. That product is called iMerge. We have soil moisture from satellites called SMAP, the Soil Moisture Active Passive Mission. I've mentioned the Evaporative Stress Index, and the specific algorithm that's used here is called Alexi. Martha Anderson and Chris Hain are two of the leads of that. For vegetation, obviously, we've got our workhorse, which is MODIS, but you know, now MODIS is being transitioned to VEERS, which is your operational NOAA sensor. And then, of course, for finer scales, you've got Landsat. For snow, especially for snow-covered area, we've got MODIS. But for snow depth, it's a little harder, or snow water equivalent, it's a little harder to sense that remotely. We have an instrument that measures snow water equivalent, but it works really well in flatter areas, not as well in high topography regions. So we're working on a snow mission concept for NASA, actually. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, GRACE, right? The terrestrial water storage. And what's cool about GRACE, it actually measures gravity. So what it's really, it's like a weighing lysimeter for all of Earth. And so what you can do there when you combine it with a model is you can infer how much of the mass change is due to water change, which is what most of the mass change is related to. And from that, you can partition it into changes in soil moisture as well as changes in groundwater. And that's where that groundwater indicator comes from that I showed you earlier. So I think it's really exciting that we have not only the advances in modeling, but also in remote sensing that allow new capabilities for monitoring drought. So just one example, which is SMAP, right? That was the Soil Moisture Active Passive mission that I mentioned. And this mission is it's interesting because it measures soil moisture in about a 5 centimeter, so a very shallow layer. But what this paper did, and there's been other work like this, but this is just an example. This is work from Eric Wood's group at Princeton, and they developed a drought monitoring index for CONUS using SMAP. And the way they did this was they first, if you look over here on the left, they used some techniques which were filters to basically pick out the areas where SMAP was expected to do a good job. Okay, so if it's dark green over here, it passed both of their tests. So everywhere that's dark green, they think SMAP can do a good job. This is for the warm season. In the cold season, they did a different set of tests, and the dark brown is where it passed both tests. The light brown is where it maybe passed one of the tests, and similarly, light green, it passed one test. If it's white, it didn't work at all, and if it's red up here or bluish purple down here, it only passed one of the 2 tests. So with that in mind, they did a comparison of the SMAP-based drought index for some periods of time, and they compared it with a 1-month SPI, with a model which is called VIC, and then with the drought monitor, which is on the lower. And so many of you know the drought monitor is a process that involves many types of inputs, some of which are indicators, some of which are reports from state climatologists and other information, and they synthesize that all together to produce a map. So it's really our best estimate of where drought is occurring at any given time. But one of the things they wanted to highlight was, for some of these droughts, SMAP does a good job. And you can see some of the same features in SMAP. And these, as far as I understand it, I don't believe SMAP is currently used, at least at this time. This was in 2017. So, so these were sort of independent sources of information. Okay, so we've come a long way with our remote sensing, and there's lots of options here. We've also come a long way with our modeling. So some of you probably are aware of the modeling effort called the North American Land Data Assimilation System. And the version 2 products are used a lot for drought. There's a couple of papers here that were published in the mid 2010s, that where we tried to use drought, we tried to estimate drought using objective blends from these land surface models. So this was an example over here with Xia et al, where basically we used a machine learning algorithm to fit weights to the different NLDAS outputs and ask if we could reproduce the drought monitor. And we did a decent job. It wasn't perfect by any stretch. And you can see here a time series of, this is, I assume most of you are familiar with the drought monitor categories, but just in case you're not, right? So anything that's yellow here is D0 to D4. D0 is really developing drought, whereas D1 to D4 gets the darker color below it, D2, D3, and then D4 would be the most extreme drought. So you can see if you look over time, this is the percent of the US that was in drought. I'm sorry, this was Texas only. And this was during a period of deep drought in Texas, and especially at the end here in 2011. So another Texas example is this one, where this group used a statistical blend of some other indicators like SPI6, which is a 6-month precipitation, SRI3, which is a 3-month runoff, and soil moisture percentiles. And again, they were trying to fit basically to mimic the drought monitor. So lots of work has been going on where we try to use models to estimate drought. We try to use remotely sensed observations to estimate drought. But at the end of the day, the holy grail is the drought monitor, right? Which is a very complicated process, right? So, if you look at individual indicators, like all those that I showed at the beginning, how they relate to the final drought monitor is not very well understood. So, on the left here, this is what they call an objective short-term blend, right? Where they just take these different inputs. So down here in the lower left, okay, you take the Palmer index and you take a 1-month SPI and a 3-month SPI and a soil moisture model, and you just use these weights as percentages everywhere. And you take those weights and out pops this map, right? And you could think of it like, if you're a forecaster, you could think of this as maybe like a first guess, right? Like a first guess of what drought is looking like right now. But at the end, which is shown here, so you can see the dates. This is very recent. So there's August 15th. This is the indicator blend. And then here's August 18th, which is the actual map that came out. And you can say, well, you know, they're pretty similar, right? I mean, obviously they don't do the wet areas in the drought monitor. They only do the dry areas. But what you can notice is that, you know, the spatial scales are a little different, right? The information in some of these indices is not as finely spatially resolved as it is in these maps. There's also different pieces of information here. There's S and L, where S stands for short term, which is this less than 6 months, whereas long term is greater than. You know, this particular blend that I'm showing on the left is a short term blend, which is meant to mimic the S parts of this, not necessarily the L parts of this. But you can see they're pretty close. You know, there's a lot in common. And, you know, one of the things that we've been trying to find out is how each indicator that goes into those blends, and ultimately all these new indicators that I've been talking about, how do they actually relate to what's in the drought monitor? And so we did 2 sets of experiments here. So let me take a minute to explain it because it's pretty complicated. Okay, so let's start with the one on the bottom, which is mutual information. Okay, so what we did was, you see all of these indicators on the bottom. So this is the Z index, that's the Palmer Z index. There's a 60-month version. There's the meteorological drought for Palmer. There's the hydrological drought for Palmer. There's 1 month, 3 months, 6, 12, and 24 and 60-month precipitation indicators. And then this is that CPC soil moisture, okay? And all we did here, there was no modeling involved. We just took the indicator, each indicator individually, and we asked the question, what is the fractional information? And we used entropy as an information content quantifier. So in this analysis, you basically ask the question, how much information about the US Drought Monitor is contained with that single indicator? So it's as though each indicator, you know, if you had to pick just one indicator and use that to mimic the US Drought Monitor, which one would you pick, and which one is the closest in terms of providing information? And let me just also note that information would go up to 1 would be perfect. Okay, so right now all of these indicators, what's interesting is you start to notice that, you know, you could pick Palmer or either Palmer, and you would get about 20 to 25% of the information of the drought index, of the drought monitor, excuse me. And in each of these, you know, is independent. And I should also note, I didn't point this out. We did this analysis 3 ways. We did it for all of CONUS. So the blue is all of CONUS. And the orange is for the Western US, and the green is for the Eastern or non-Western US. And the way we divided those up was in the long-term blends, there's actually a separate set of equations for the West and the East, and we just used that as the boundary. Okay, so we came up with, in this example at the bottom, we're just asking the question, if you had to pick one indicator to mimic the drought, which one matches the drought monitor the best? And what you find is that they're all hovering around the 20% mark. And keep in mind that these are independent. So we're not looking at the mutual information between the indicators. We're just looking at the information between the indicator and the drought monitor. So it's just those 2 individually. And so it's interesting because you find a lot of the model-based analyses come up with soil moisture as the primary indicator. Whereas it's, you know, in these blends, and here's, by the way, here's the the actual percentages. This short-term blend is what I just showed you earlier. And here's the long-term blend for the east and the west. And you can see that Palmer's about 25 in the long-term blend. And it's kind of interesting because that's sort of what pops out here. But keeping in mind that this is independent. So it assumes that there's no essentially overlapping information between these in this analysis. So what you also start to notice is that the 12-month, especially in the west, right? So look at the west, how there's a longer time scale for the west versus in the east. There's the, 1, 3, 6 is the peak, and then it goes down to 12. And obviously that's related to the snowpack. So it's kind of an interesting analysis just to, to understand how the information in individual indicators relates to what's in the drought monitor. The second part of the analysis is machine learning based. So in this case, we actually used these indicators to fit a machine learning neural network model with one intermediate layer and 8 neurons. So in this case, the overlap of the information is considered. And so this would be essentially, these all add up to 1. And in this case, it's not the same thing as the information theory. This is a different metric, but it's relevance, which if you think of it as a weight, if you were to come up with weights for the CONUS, Western, and non-Western areas, and over here what you notice is that the differences kind of go away between the indicators, and 24-month precip clearly becomes the dominant indicator. And the Palmer in particular, the hydrology Palmer, goes way down because probably there's a lot of duplicated information between the Palmer meteorology and the Palmer hydrological drought indicator. So this work is still ongoing. This is work actually funded by NIDIS, and we're still continuing to do this work, but it's an example of how we're looking at different indicators and trying to understand how we might look at how indicators relate to the drought monitor. And of course, this can vary based on where you are, what season. We didn't go that far with this analysis. This is just for all the years of available data. So let me move on and talk about the rest of what's in that paper. So if you look at drought and we look at trying to understand the physics of droughts, one of the important points about droughts is that, the NLDAS, I mentioned that earlier, the North American Land Data Assimilation System, that only goes back to 1979. So if you do a lot of analysis based on NLDAS, you don't get the full period of record for some of the really severe droughts in this century. And so the first thing we decided to do was that we needed a data set that could go back in time, in this case back to 1915. And we extended the data set by Ben Livna et al. All the way back to, which had already been developed back into 1915, but we extended it forward in time to 2018 because we wanted to capture the recent droughts. So that was the first step, is we had to have an input data set of meteorology that goes back in time and up to as close to the present as we thought was reasonable. And then we had to have a model that can simulate some of the physics that we want to understand. And the model that we picked is a model called NOAA-MP, the multi-parameterization version of NOAA, which is the land surface model that's used in EMC right now. The standard NOAA is what's used. NOAA-MP adds a bunch of physics options, in particular groundwater and dynamic vegetation phenology. So we ran 3 different drought reconstructions for the baseline, which is the original NOAA model where vegetation is prescribed and there is no groundwater, there's just free drainage at the bottom boundary condition. And then we added groundwater to this model, and we also added phenology. So there were 3 different runs. And then there was a fourth run actually where we turned groundwater and vegetation on at the same time. So, okay, so what we did in this paper, and by the way, I should acknowledge, so Lu Su is a researcher at UCLA. She works with Dennis Ladmeyer. She is the one that set up these runs. And she has her own paper, which was on that list that I showed you at the beginning, where she describes this data set. And she's actually going to be making the drought reconstruction available publicly. And the citation will be in the paper about how to get the data. So it's a really neat resource for those of you that might want to study historical droughts. Okay, so we made this data set, we reproduced the droughts, and then this is just an example to show you, and I should, related to the previous discussion, in our paper, we used soil moisture percentiles as our drought indicator. So we didn't compute any special indicator. We just took soil moisture percentile as an indicator of drought. And we, as you can see here, and the percentile colors are similar to the drought monitor colors, the 1930s droughts, the 1950s, 1970s, and then the more recent, the 2012 drought. Those were all reproduced with this reconstruction. So that's the first example of using a reconstruction just to look at previous droughts, okay? The next thing we did, and this is really the meat of the paper, is that we started to look at how the drought behaves over time depending on two things. On the left, this is the 1934 drought, okay? So on the left, what you see are soil moisture percentiles versus time, and the colors are for the different physics options that we picked. And so at the top is the precipitation, so that's just for reference. And one of the things you notice about this is that the baseline, right, so that's with fixed vegetation. So vegetation in this one does not respond to drought, okay? And what you notice is that the vegetation, because it doesn't respond to drought, the drought goes much deeper. So if you think of the soil moisture percentile as an indicator of intensity of drought, well, what's happening is the vegetation thinks it's still got enough greenness, it hasn't adjusted to the lack of water other than to perhaps shut down transpiration. But in terms of its growth, in terms of its available green vegetation, the leaf area index, it still thinks it has as much leaf area under drought as it did in a non-drought year. So if you look at that dynamic veg, which is the pink one, you can see clearly that the drought intensity gets reduced because the vegetation responds. And the other really different thing is, so you see here, over here in the middle, that sort of green-brown color, that's with groundwater turned on, but no dynamic vegetation. So one of the things we noticed about the groundwater is that when you turn on groundwater versus not in the dynamic veg case, the groundwater delays the recovery because the anomalies in the water in the root zone and ultimately in recharge are preserved for longer time periods. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. So if you went straight from the baseline to vegetation, you'd have a shorter drought, right? Because the pink lines, this 20 percentile is sort of the threshold for indicating a drought. And you can see when you cross that threshold, that time period is much less. But if you have groundwater, it goes back to being a longer time period. Okay, so let me switch over to here. This is the same data. Okay, so the black line here is the same as over here. This is soil moisture as an indicator of drought. Okay, and it's over that same time period. What we did here was we said, what if we took that same model-based reconstruction and we computed SPI6 and SPEI6 and then a Palmer index? And how would that change the representation of drought over time? And what's really striking about this is when Palmer becomes the drought indicator, the drought onset is much, much earlier than the the black line, which is your soil moisture-based drought indicator. SPI is kind of similar. There might be some anomaly here where there was a little bit of dryness, but then it recovered. So what's really interesting is this dryness and recovery in the SPI leads to a later, well, an earlier onset, but then a not as intense indication of drought and an earlier recovery. In the Palmer, as opposed to the soil moisture, right, you can see that the onset is much sooner. Whereas if you look at the end of the drought, the recovery period, they're pretty similar, but there is a much slower recovery of dryness. If you think of the threshold between 20% and 30% as abnormally dry, but not drought. So it's a very interesting example of how, depending on which physics you have and which model, which indicator you have, you can get a quite different answer about what is happening in drought. And why do we care about this as a drought task force? Well, if you've read any papers about projecting drought into the future, most of those papers either use soil moisture or PDSI. And I think what's interesting about this analysis is that what you would see, of course, it depends on the physics of those papers that, these models that we're using to project climate, but it also depends on which indicator you use. And this is in this case, I should also point out, for those of you that are savvy about PDSI, there's been some debate about which formulation is used for calculating the evaporative part of that. And in this particular example, we used a Pendon-Monteith, an energy balance based one, not a temperature based one, which has been shown to have other issues. So anyway, with all that said, this paper looks at how these choices in indicator and in physics affect the representation of drought. So we did the same thing for 2012, and I know many of you are, you're probably more familiar with 2012. This was a classic flash drought, and in the upper Midwest. So again, it's the same analysis, that you've seen before, and you just have a look over here. So the first thing, is to look at the baseline, right? So the baseline is what you would get out of the standard NOAA model, okay? Deeper drought, and again, because the vegetation doesn't have time to respond. In the baseline runs, vegetation is specified. So the leaf area index, the green vegetation fraction, it's all the same as if there was no drought at all, okay? However, if you have dynamic vegetation, what you clearly see, and this is something we've seen in some of our work as well, in dynamic vegetation, what happens is the vegetation stops transpiring and stops growing to the point where the transpiration shuts off and actually the drought recovers more quickly. And I'm going to show you something about how to fix that in a minute, because what we've found is that sometimes these vegetation models cut transpiration off to the point where they're not able to transpire anymore at all, and they tend to be a little too wet. You can see the groundwater model is in between, okay? But this is another interesting example where when you have vegetation responding to drought, you get a different drought in terms of the model. In the case of the different indicators, again, you get a wildly different response here. And if you remember especially thinking about the difference between SPI and SPEI, I think this is a great example of that, because as you know, if you've studied this 2012 drought, the key indicator here was that it was a very hot, dry period. And it wasn't so much anomalous rainfall, but it was more of this hot, drying period that led to this drought, and it stressed the vegetation. And so SPEI, which includes a representation of some of that stress by having an evaporation parameterization, it gets an early drought just like the PDSI does, whereas the soil moisture and the SPI-based droughts are much later. And then similarly, the recoveries are quite different, the trajectories, partly because soil moisture has a delayed recovery, as compared to something like SPEI or even PDSI. So, I think the point of this paper and this exercise was to use these reconstructions to understand the processes and try to understand what they mean with respect to different drought onsets, severity, and duration. So, we have the data for this entire period. I'm just showing you a time series again with reference to Lu Su's work. And, she looked at differences between the baseline and the groundwater, or differences between the baseline and the dynamic vegetation, just trying to understand what is the difference of area in drought, or at least considered to be dry. And the blue line is the difference. So you can see in this particular example, really in terms of drought area, the dynamic vegetation has a huge impact, more so than the groundwater. But as I will show you, the groundwater has a bigger impact on the recovery and the timing. So I mentioned about, I use those examples to show you how drought is sensitive to the vegetation, right? So if you have an interactive vegetation that grows or stops growing based on drought, you'll get a different type of drought. And in this example, we've actually done a study where we used observations of leaf area index in a model. So the model I showed you, this reconstruction, has no data assimilation in it. So it just simulates the vegetation using the equations in the model. In this example, what we did was we actually corrected the simulation of vegetation using observed leaf area index from satellite data. And when we did that, what we found is that everything that's red here is an increase in correlation with the drought monitor. So everywhere where it's red and orange, basically the model not only did it do a better job with vegetation, but it got the droughts better. So what this really means is if you're trying to monitor drought, you really need to use information about the vegetation in your model in order to make sure it's representing those coupled processes. And this was one of the other papers we submitted to that same special collection in Journal of Hydrometeorology. So again, this will be on the list once it's all public. Okay, so let me wrap up with two more examples. Okay, so the first example is groundwater. So I mentioned how, I showed you those time series of groundwater and how they delayed the recovery. So this is another really interesting example. Some of you are familiar with the long drought in California from the, basically like 2015 to 2017. And more or less, we were kept hoping for atmospheric rivers to, to basically, help recover from drought. In this example, notice there's two different dates here. January 3rd is the top. January 24th is the bottom. Okay. At the top, what you see is that things are still very severe, right? It's the most exceptional drought, as it's called, which is the D4. Okay. And this was before a big atmospheric river event. So the soil moisture is not, it's wet in some areas, but it's mostly really dry. And the groundwater in particular is super dry. After a big atmospheric river event, you can see this is the soil moisture, which is super wet almost everywhere. So you would think, well, that would lead to a recovery, right? But no, because the groundwater itself is still quite dry because the recovery of groundwater is quite slow. So this is an example where, despite the information in the soil moisture, the groundwater has important information in the drought monitor. And so if you just use soil moisture as your indicator for drought, you're going to miss these slow recoveries due to sustained groundwater withdrawal. Okay, so the last example is snow drought. So we've talked a lot about the east and the middle of the country, but we haven't spent as much time on snow. And this is one figure from our paper that I want to take a minute to explain. So there's three things that are on here. Okay, so the first curve I want you to look at is the black curve. The black curve is snow water equivalent, And these are return periods, right? So the higher the return period, the lower the probability, which means it's more extreme. Okay, so you can see the stars here are different colors. So the stars correspond to a specific year over here. So green would be 2015, the red one is 1976, the yellow one is 77, and so on. Okay, so that's the actual snow water equivalent. And this is just a zoom in so you can see it better. Okay, the brownish color or light tan color is accumulated precipitation. Okay, so if you think about snow, there's two things that you care about in a snow drought. One is how much precipitation is falling. Okay, so this shows the percentiles of precipitation, or the return periods, excuse me. Okay, the bluish curve is the mean winter temperature, and this scale is reversed because you want, if temperatures are hot, that's more extreme, and it means snow is going to melt more. So one of the points we make in the paper is that for snow drought, obviously you have to understand both precipitation and temperature to get the right snow drought physics, because this green star here, green star is indicating the worst SWE ever in this observation. And this is April 1st snow water equivalent. This is used for a lot of water supply forecasting. So it's the worst ever here, but as you can see in terms of precipitation, it's actually not the worst. It's up here. And what's really the game changer here is temperature is near the worst. It's the second worst. Similarly, for the red star, right, you can see the precipitation is really, really low, and the temperature is not so bad. So maybe, you know, it's still a really low SWE because you just didn't get enough, but the melt was not the main root cause because the temperatures were not super abnormal. So this is just an example of trying to look at the processes involved in snow drought by understanding the controls from the precipitation and the temperatures. Okay, so that wraps up my tour of the paper and some other work that's been going on in the Drought Task Force. So we focused on advancing monitoring and prediction. We looked at different indicators from models, from remote sensing, and we're still working on understanding the relationship of these indicators to the drought monitor. I showed you this new model-based reconstruction and how we can understand the physics by looking at that. And of course, the key takeaway is that depending on which indicator you use and which physics you pick, it strongly affects the estimates of drought onset, intensity, and duration, right? So we saw with the dynamic vegetation, when the vegetation was growing, that it might have smaller coverage, but it has lower severity or maybe average severity versus that baseline where it just got really severe quickly because the vegetation didn't respond. For groundwater, you can see droughts typically have longer temporal durations, and of course, for predicting recovery, that's important. So with that, I will end and I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Krista. What a great seminar. So I'll start with a couple of questions, and while I'm sharing them, please feel free to raise your hand or add a question in the question box. So two questions that came to mind. One is that working with our local forecast offices and also people who specialize in regional climate, a question that comes up is drought getting worse in my area? And so I wonder if you could talk about drought indicators and if they're appropriate for looking at that question and which ones you'd recommend. And then my second question is related to the Precipitation Grand Challenge, which NOAA has started. And so I wonder if you could talk about what the impact of better precipitation forecasts would be for drought.
Right. Okay, great. So in terms of the first question, which is drought getting worse? Okay, so one of the challenges with the drought monitor is that it only goes back, now forgotten the initial date. I'm sure somebody on this call knows the initial date, but it doesn't go back very far. It's like the 2000s sometime. And so it's difficult to look at trends when you have such a short time series, which is why that reconstruction going back to 1915 is so important. So my suggestion would be that we could use things like these reconstructions, as long as they're constrained with data, to understand what is changing. And you might find that, I mean, we already know that precipitation is changing, temperature is changing. And so trying to assess whether drought is changing would require something like this reconstruction to understand what aspects of drought might be changing. So is it the evaporative demand that's changing? Is it the soil moisture profile? Is it the groundwater? So that would be my suggestion, is that we expect them to change, but we don't have the tools without these types of reconstructions to properly understand all of the mechanisms of drought. And even if we do have long-term precipitation records, as I showed you, if you use SPI as an indicator by itself, it will not give you a good approximation to the drought monitor. So just using precipitation to indicate drought going backwards would not answer your question. So I don't know if I answered your question, but okay.
Yes,
so should I move to the second one?
Sure, that would be great.
Okay, so the second one is about precipitation prediction. This relates to the forecasting drought challenge, right? So one of the things that we try to do in the Drought Task Force is understand the underlying causes of precipitation and temperature anomalies, things like ENSO and teleconnections, NAO, et cetera. So for us in the drought world, I think, what you want is to be able to not only predict precipitation, but you want to be able to predict the other parts that control drought, right? So you need to understand not only how precipitation is changing, but you need to understand temperature, humidity, all the things that control the water and energy balance of the land surface, because ultimately drought is essentially a water balance anomaly. And so what you really need to be able to predict is the water balance, not just precipitation. So it's an important, and it's the leading, the leading control on drought is precipitation anomalies, but it's not the only control. So I guess I would say that, moving forward, being able to understand that at timescales that matter for drought is another grand challenge, right? So, we do a pretty good job at the subseasonal to seasonal scale. There was one of our papers that I mentioned at the beginning is based on SubX, which was the seasonal to subseasonal experiment. And they were looking at the question of whether it could reproduce the 2012 drought and how far back it could have done that. You get pretty good skill at a month or so for precip, but then beyond that, it gets really tricky. So, but you may be able to have better skill if you think of it as predicting the water balance, including the evaporation, which is related to the energy balance. So I think thinking about drought as that water and energy coupled system and predicting the water balance is the way forward. So, yeah, so hopefully that addresses your question, but I could follow up if I didn't quite hit the point you were going for.
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much, Krista. So are there any final questions? I don't see any in the question box, but thank you. We'll just end by saying thank you again to Krista for the great webinar today, and just for my colleagues within NOAA, this webinar is going to be recorded, so it'll be available for anyone who wasn't able to join us live. So thank you again, Krista, and thank you again for everyone for participating.
All right, thank you. Hey, Maggie, are you going to be posting the presentation or just did you just save a copy for yourself?
The GoToWebinar will record the whole thing, so we can post if you're open to that, and would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I forgot about the recording.
Great, it does that automatically. So, all right, thanks
Yep.
so much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks.